This is the season finale. This is episode 10. We've done 10 episodes. And I was just thinking about it, especially because I'm in a tank top in San Francisco. It's July, and we started this process almost a year ago. Lots of life happened in the last year. Everyone told me podcasts, they take some work, quite a bit of work. I highly recommend working with a producer. That made this process a lot easier. Jacob Richmond, shout out. And you can also do it on your own. It just takes more time and effort. We've talked to lots of families, solo parents, 2 moms, 2 dads, lots of child-free folks. In this episode, we are focusing on the children of unique families. We're talking to 2 therapists who are going to give us some guidance on how to approach topics, not just being part of a unique family, but issues like death and illness and disability. There's lots of things that you need to figure out how to make those concepts age appropriate. And the most important thing is having those conversations with kids early on. And in the context of being part of a unique family, it's an opportunity to normalize the situation for your child. Learning about inclusion begins at home, and having these conversations is a great starting point. Thank you for listening. It's been really wonderful to hear feedback from folks I know and also folks I don't know. It seems as though this topic is quite resonant, and I even learned of other podcasts that are talking about non-traditional family structures. So I'm super happy that this is becoming a broader conversation, because that was the whole point in starting this podcast. Please enjoy talking to kids about being part of a unique family. Hi, welcome to Doing This Differently, a podcast that celebrates non-traditional family structures. I'm your host, Nicole Foley, a solo mom living in San Francisco with my daughter, Dylan. In each episode, we talk to families who are forging their own unique paths, and together we expand our definition of what family looks like. I created this podcast to celebrate the diversity of family, to have non-traditional families share their stories and experiences with us. I wanted to give a voice to every family and life path that color outside of the lines of how many of us perceive the idea of family. All of my guests, regardless of the environment they grew up in, shared a similar vision of their future family. And it looked a lot like what I call the 1950s era traditional structure. You have your mom, dad, kids, plural, maybe a dog. And instead, they all found themselves on more unique paths, like becoming a solo mom, or 2 moms, 2 dads, having a partner and no kids, fostering a teenager, or a circle of friends who are more like family. All of these paths are beautiful. I especially love Caroline's idea in episode 8, Child-Free and the Role of Chosen Family, where she suggests we have parties to mark and celebrate our enduring friendships that often outlive marriages and partnerships. Today, we're focusing on the kiddos of unique families. When children are born, the person or people taking care of them are their complete world. They're not questioning anything about their family. The only thing that's being exchanged between the baby and parent or caregiver is love. But as they develop and begin to socialize, children start to see other examples of families. More often than not, they're seeing that most families follow the traditional structure. They may begin to recognize that their family looks different, and they'll have questions about that. We're fortunate to have with us today 2 therapists who will provide some guidance on how parents and caregivers can navigate conversations with children about being part of a unique family. Leora Lerba is a psychotherapist who specializes in working with couples and parents around complicated topics such as substance abuse, ADHD, and other challenges that arrive both individually and in relationships. She works with clients to increase self-awareness, cultivate insight, and integrate techniques to cope with life's complications. Originally from Australia, she now lives in the Bay Area and works with clients all over California. Michaelson is a therapist specializing in relationships with self and others. She works with individuals in private consultations as well as leading group workshops across the country. Using her knowledge of the human energy body, intuition, and personal soul contracts, she guides others toward a healthier version of self. Leora, Meg, welcome.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us today.
Thank you so much for joining me today. I know I have plenty of questions on this topic, and I appreciate you sharing your wisdom with us. So there are many challenging conversations parents and caregivers may need to have with their children. Maybe it's explaining things like illness or death or disability. In general, How would you advise parents address these topics in a way that's age appropriate?
That's such a great question. And first and foremost, what I have found is yes, age appropriate. And then also, where are they emotionally? Because
Hmm.
two kids can be the same age, however, have different emotional levels. And there are a lot of good resources out there that help you guide age appropriate. Something I have learned is less is more.
Hmm.
It's few words because kids say they're 2 or 3 or 4. After a couple sentences, they're over there. And
Hmm.
so sometimes as a parent, we want to say more than is necessary. So less is more, and then asking them questions, asking wonder questions. And Nicole, you're good at that with your daughters, asking, what do you think about that?
Hmm.
And that's a beautiful way to start. And of course, when you're having one tough conversation or something that is of importance, you've had other conversations along the way, so you understand where they are at.
Hmm. What about you, Leora?
The first thing I was thinking about is that your kid, whoever you're talking to,
Hmm.
whoever I'm talking to as the adult, trusting that the adult knows their kid and knows what they might be open to hearing. So I guess similar to what Meg is saying about the fact that age doesn't necessarily imply what they might be able to hear. But my main thing was just simplify, especially at the beginning. Just a sentence that they can understand is usually enough. Making sure you're being honest, because what we're going to do is build on that picture as they get older. So not kind of telling them one thing and then, once they hit 5, changing the story to tell them a whole different narrative.
Sure.
Keep it straight from the beginning. Um, and I think the other big thing is that remembering that kids just take this as lore. They're not asking like, but what about this and how does that? They're mostly at the beginning going to say, okay, thanks for telling me that, and that's kind of it. So being really careful, I think, for ourselves as well, not to expect that we're going to sit down and have an hour-long conversation, especially when they're under 5, one sentence, and then opening the floor up to them and letting them ask you questions and explore that more, but not expecting that we're going to be, giving a lecture and explaining everything. And I think sometimes it's easy to fall into that trap. We want to explain, give them the whole picture and tie it all together, but really just one sentence.
And to also, before you have these conversations with your kids, check in to see where you're at. Because if you're feeling unstable about it, it might not be the best time. They trust where we're at. Just as much as we know them, they know us. And so if we're really unsteady, it might not be the best time to have the conversation, or just tell them, can we talk later, based on what their age is. Because we have to get comfortable with whatever it is.
I know that there are very destabilizing experiences that we can all have, especially if a parent becomes ill kind of out of the blue. And if you're caring for your child and you're also caring for a parent or a loved one, what would you recommend the adult do, the parent in the middle do to, because you're bringing up at a really great point where you need to be modeling sort of that stability for your child and also signaling to them that they're still safe, they're okay, even if the circumstances have changed dramatically. um, how would you recommend that that parent basically self-regulate or um, get to a point where they are in the best position to have that conversation with their child?
Really good question. And it's going to depend on who you are and where you're at and what the circumstance is. People are dealing with things all the time, and some of those are really hard: housing, finance. And when you are looking at something that is causing you deep emotional stress, because oftentimes it is, and we want to keep our kids in a safe container, and we want them to feel like mom is hurting, but I'm okay. So when we can get to that place, that would be a good time to have the conversation, which means, of course, most of us don't do nearly enough self-care. We just don't. And that's so vital. So having your own tribe, your own support, and then address your child.
I think you really nailed it, Nicole, when you said modeling, because we want to model stability, but we also get to model what to do when you're feeling unstable. And, reminding your kids that we get to regulate. So maybe saying, Mama's going to take a few deep breaths now, or my body's telling me that it needs to wiggle around or do a dance, whatever that might look like, to get to really show them all those pieces as well. And in terms of having those conversations, I was just also thinking about being mindful of time of day. Are you tired? Are these conversations better to have, when we're out and about, when we're sitting in the car? I love sitting in the car and having chats with my kids because then they want to stop and think and look out the window and process it. That's what works for me. But really starting to think about those pieces as well. What does the whole picture look like? And how do they get time to stabilize and regulate after that conversation as well?
That's a great suggestion, to have the conversation in the car, because the two of you are not facing each other. You're in an activity, and as you say, they can look out the window and kind of reflect. It's funny too. I've heard that the car plays such a big role during teenage years. I have heard more than one parent say, if you want to know what's going on with your teen, go for a long road trip or just have those conversations. I know that stereotypically teenagers don't really want to engage in conversations with their parents, but like having that sort of captive audience, even if they're tuning out for part of the time, listening to music or something like that. That's a great strategy, is just to have that conversation. It's almost like a low pressure environment to be able to check in.
And we want to also really be okay that we're not going to do it perfect. There are times where all of us as parents, and I can say always all of us, have messed up. We are in the middle of a stress ball and our kid is tugging on us, and we might turn around and say, I'm really dealing with blah, 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 right? Because we're human. And so then we get to go back and reassure. And it's a perfect teachable moment because they get to see mom is not perfect. And mom can say, I'm sorry, and coddle and bring that security bond back. But we're all going to mess up through these hard things. We are.
Something that I want to just share with people, especially if they have younger children and have a similar attitude that I do towards screen time. I went through a very stressful situation a few months back, and it required all of me to figure out how to navigate the situation. And I'm also having to care for my child. And I felt very defeated by one of the strategies that I implemented. And it also was such a huge lifesaver, which was TV. I needed time to myself to figure out what I needed to do. And I was like, you know what? We're going to turn on, Paw Patrol, and you're going to get so much screen time. I mean, she loved every second of that. And I wasn't happy about that, but it did serve me and it calmed her. And she was able to enjoy herself while I'm off kind of making a lot of phone calls and making a lot of plans. But I can also tell you that you can go back to your very limited screen time world after. It does work, even if they still want that. You just have to do whatever you can to create the space that you need as the parent to navigate the situation. And it worked for us, and even if it wasn't something that I really wanted to do. But yeah.
So I want to jump in here because I actually feel very passionate about this. Screen time is a tool. And as long as it's just one tool that you have and not the only tool that we use all the time, it is a wildly effective tool.
Yeah.
And go for gold. Use your discretion. Use it as you need. I recently had to take a really long plane flight with my family. And somebody asked me, like, well, what are the kids going to do? And I was like, they're going to watch TV for 12 hours. And somebody said to me, like, what? And I was like, what do you want to do on a plane? Be honest. It's not going to happen every day. I hope we don't have to do this flight for a very long time, but that's going to work. And then we're going to go back to our normal lives tomorrow. And like I said, as long as we have other tools and we're expanding our toolbox and making really careful decisions about when and how, go to town. It's more effective than most things.
Oh yeah, and just to be clear, yeah, all rules are out the window when we're on a plane. In fact, and I think because it kind of has that feel of a special occasion, yeah, she's enjoying flights for sure. So yes, that is a really helpful tool, especially during those longer flights. Absolutely.
And I would say as well, the other thing to think about is that there's which screen time, right? Or like which program we're watching. And as they get older, there's more options. And there are really, I mean, we've all seen really wonderful things on TV and learned a lot and helped us process our development. So just again, discernment is everything, but I think we have to be really careful of judging any of those things as only bad because they're not.
Sure. And to be clear, I don't judge anybody else's choices. It was just more like I know what it's like to take screen time away from Dylan, and she just turns into a different child. And so I learned early on, I'm like, I don't like that. So I'm going to limit it. Side note, I completely agree with Leora that screen time is a tool. Recently, I was having a conversation with a stay-at-home mom, and I asked her, how on earth do you get anything done? And she said, I don't typically get much done. In fact, the only way that she's able to get anything done is if her child is periodically getting some screen time so that mom can focus on some things. And I told her that if it wasn't for the fact that I have had childcare since Dylan was 3 months old, I would not have gotten anything done myself. It's only because I've had childcare that I can limit screen time for Dylan. To be perfectly clear, I am not one of those moms who has 1,000 ideas on how to entertain their child and all kinds of incredible arts and crafts. I see so much on TikTok where just plotting these moms who not only have the ideas but have all the tools to entertain a child. Sometimes mama just needs a moment to herself. And I'll tell you what, Sunday afternoons, early evenings, that's usually my point where I'm just like, here, what do you want to watch? And she knows it. She gets really excited. And back to the conversation. So I know that you're going to talk to a 3-year-old differently than you will a 5, 8, 10, 15-year-old. How do you evolve these conversations? Because it might even be the same topic, but how do you evolve the conversation so that it continues to be age appropriate and you're evolving it as your child grows?
What I have learned with working with kids is the beautiful thing about as they age and they start having friends over, or you're in a place with friends and you hear them talk to each other, you can really learn what level they're at. And some of the things that you have been saying might actually be said to their friend. So paying attention to how they're talking to others helps you understand where they're at. And also, about age 7 is where kids start to tune into the age of reason. That's where they start to develop their own mind. And then we can talk to them in a less adult, but more adult way, more reasonable at around that age. So you can expand the concepts. And of course, like everything else, it's asking them questions and seeing what questions they ask you. At that age, we still don't need to tell them as much as we would say to an adult, of course. And less is still more, but they will ask, especially if you're developing a relationship with them, then they're going to be comfortable to ask the questions.
How would you recommend creating that safe space from an early age so that as they get older, they feel comfortable talking to you at any stage?
Well, I want to start off by saying, even if you didn't create it when they were really young, we can always work on creating a safe container. Doesn't matter how old they are, even if they're in their 20s now. You can always create a safe container over time with your children by being open, by being calm, by when, as much as we can, right? majority of the time, like the same with food. We're supposed to eat 80% healthy, 20% unhealthy. Well, if we could have 80% healthy communication, then the 20% isn't so bad. So, and that same concept. And so when you're allowing yourself to have that safe container, in my belief, that is being open and okay if they have a different opinion, not necessarily disrespectful. That's two different things. But you can hear their opinion even though it's not theirs, and you're not making them wrong. That creates a really healthy, what I would call a safe container. Less yelling, more hearing, more listening, and more asking questions.
Do you have any language for like an example if how to engage somebody if you can tell that maybe they want to talk or need to talk, but they're not maybe seemingly ready? What would be language to invite them or at least let them know that you are always willing to listen to them?
Tell them a story. I'm a big believer in stories. Now, whether it's a story about your own childhood or someone you know, as long as you know it's a safe thing to say, and just sending out wonder questions and allowing the pause. And this took me a long time to learn with my own children, allowing that pause. So a wonder question would be, I wonder what you're thinking, or I wonder what you think about that. Hey, look it over there. What do you think about that? And then just saying nothing. And it might take them multiple minutes to say something. But when we're okay with that space, then they start to feel like they can open up. And when we urge them to open up, just like when we're urged or pushed, we feel threatened. So it's the same thing.
It's not an invitation.
Yeah.
Feels more like a demand. Yeah, no, that's great. I wonder. I love that.
I came up with this analogy this morning, and I actually kind of wanted to see if it worked, but I was thinking about like drawing, right? So like we start with a blank paper when they're really little and they just kind of scribble, and then we maybe give them a silhouette. And then as they get older, we give them more complicated designs. And then at the end, eventually we give them a blank page again, because you've got all the tools. You can draw and color as you need. And I think that analogy kind of works as like start fresh with zero and then really slowly build it up.
I love that. That in combination with thoughtful silences. I think that works really well. Good combination. Leora, in your work, have you had experiences advising parents on how to have those conversations with those tough topics, whether it's death, illness, disability? How have you guided them if that's something that you've worked on?
Absolutely. This is a nice opportunity, I guess, to give a really specific example. So I've done a lot of work around disability and parents, maybe with young kids, where one child has profound disability and the other doesn't. And so for the typical child, they're learning from a very young age about difference. Except for them, it's not difference. It's their normal. It's their real life every single day. So starting to really look at, well, how do we explain this to those kids? And so the way we came up with was, from a very young age, talking about how everybody's brains and bodies are different. And that's just the fact at the beginning. Brains and bodies are different. This person's brain and body is a little bit different from other people, so they need these supports or stabilities in their life. As the kids got older, we were able to introduce the fact that different people have different chromosomes. And the kids didn't know what chromosomes were yet.
Sure.
But they were able to understand and learn a new word, and that felt very exciting. But they were able to have a label. This person has different chromosomes, and their body and brain works differently. And then slowly over time, giving them more information and really, giving them an understanding of the human body. And now there's an opportunity to talk about the human body and the brain and the physicality of it, all the while normalizing. Everybody's different. This is normal for this person. And for you, it looks slightly different again, and this is a typical experience. And that's how we decided to really give structure around it and language to it, because language is the most important thing, right?
I agree.
The kids need to be able to have those thoughts and communicate them out. And, it was really surprising for these folks. From the age of 3.5, the kid was using the word chromosomes, because that was something they could they could say. And even though they obviously didn't understand it, and I'm not really sure I understand it if I'm being honest, but we can get there and talk about the fact that things are different, and that is just how the world works.
Side note, I love the point that Leora just made. It is so empowering to have an answer to a potentially complex question, especially when you're a child. In episode 4, when we were talking to the two moms, they had mentioned that they had been at a wedding and their daughter was asked about their unique family. And with confidence, she answered. I feel like this is exactly the point that Leora is making. It's not even just providing them with language, it's giving them the empowerment to really answer on their own and feel good about the answer they're providing. This is really getting at the heart of why I wanted to talk to therapists who deal with families and individuals and children. I appreciate the building blocks that both Meg and Leora are providing on how to communicate this and the importance of communicating it to them. As they grow up and notice differences, it's an opportunity to embrace them as opposed to feel shame or weird. That's why I like using the word unique. I feel like there's something beautiful about that. It's acknowledging that something is different from, say, the norm, but it's also beautiful. And the main reason behind starting this podcast was to figure out, how do we talk to our kids? How do we talk to others about unique families? And something that's been on my mind ever since Dylan, actually before Dylan was born, is, what do I say? I have been using certain language that I think has actually reached its expiration date. And now, because she's a little older, more articulate, her brain is a little bit more developed, I need to level up my own communication with Dylan and equip her with new language and more understanding around the beauty of our family and how loved she is. And back to the conversation. And with that language and guidance, how have the typical children taken to that understanding that, as even if something is different, it's still okay? Do they have a sense of normalizing it, or is it too soon in their development to be able to perceive it that way?
My sense is yes, they love their sibling and are obsessed with their sibling, and for them, their sibling is normal. This whole situation is normal. And yet they're being asked questions all the time. Why is this like this? Because they go out in the world, they go to preschool and daycare, and other kids are curious because the situation looks different at home.
Sure.
And my sense is the typical developing kids feel so empowered that they have the answers and they can explain to their friends and the world what's going on.
Language is so important. It's so important. It's important for them to understand, but then I think also to embody it and be able to have those conversations when they are confronted with questions, because especially if it's their peers at that young age, everything is so literal. Everything is like, I'm observing this, I'm going to ask a question. There's no tact, they haven't learned that yet. They're just their little authentic selves. And so, but I think language is so critical.
As we know, raising kids, that's what they want. They want to know that they have some control, they have some power. And even if that means being able to answer a question, that makes them feel like they're in charge of the situation, as against having to turn around and say, I don't know, which again, we have to model for them. It's okay to sometimes say, I don't know. But how cool is it? We've all experienced that when someone asks us a complicated question and we have an answer ready.
And if I could add to that, and even saying, do you want to know? Asking your child, do you want to know? Do you want more information? And then we get a gauge of where they're at. Maybe that day they're not ready. Maybe the next day they'll say, yeah, I do.
That's a great strategy, because it's not one that would be obvious to me, to be like, do you want more information? Because we're coming from an adult mind talking to this child, where we've lost the frame of reference of what they can actually handle at one time. So I love that idea of checking in with them. Is this something that you want right now? Do you want more information, or do we just leave it where it's at? That's great. In the context of helping children understand that they're part of a unique family, I'll give you a very specific example. My daughter's almost 3.5. And, we had nanny shares with a nanny that and I hosted the share. And so even though she had little friends on the playground, she was sort of limited to the number of people in her world. Now she's in preschool. She's exposed to so many more children. And, pick up and drop off, you start to see a lot of parents. And I would say that over the last year, so when she was 2.5, I think, or even before 2.5, she had been asking questions about daddies. So I'm a solo mom. So there is no second parent in our household, not a daddy. And also, even before preschool, she was seeing that her friends had daddies. And even if she was seeing them far less than their mommies. But she's never directly asked me who's my daddy, but she's made comments that indicate that, for example, she thinks my dad, her grandfather, is her daddy, or a close male friend who has spent quite a bit of time with her. And my method that was recommended by UCSF and by several friends is that you read books. So this was something Meg that, and Leora, both of you have mentioned. And we would read books about unique families. Very rarely is there anything that's very specific to our experience. A lot of times it's like two moms or two dads. But I've explained to her, we're a unique family. It's just you and me. And my dad and I have explained that he is her grandfather. UCSF's guidance was to start very early, saying that a nice man gave me seeds to grow you in my belly. And my earlier question about how do you evolve these conversations, she's gotten that. She's like, okay, a nice man gave you seeds, like I understand that. And now I'm sort of, because she's so astute and so observant, I'm like, what else can I say to her for her to understand? Because I definitely think that sperm donor might be a little bit too high concept for her. And for anyone listening who's in a similar situation, my question to both of you is, how can parents help their children understand that they're in a unique family? And how would you recommend addressing these questions in a way that is appropriate for their developmental stage? Because I want to encourage Dylan to ask questions, and I ask, like, well, what do you think of that? And I'll give you an example. This happened last week where she just said, everybody at school has a mommy and a daddy and grandparents. And I asked her, I'm like, so, what's our family? And she's like, just a mommy, just a mommy and grandparents. And I asked her, what do you think of that? And her answer was just like, I like it. And it was, I just wanted more interaction with her on that, more engagement, where but I was also following her lead. And I'm just think, to your point, Meg, just like asking those questions, like, what do you think? But yeah, I would love to hear from both of you about, like, what's the best way to encourage her understanding of our unique family, and that encourage her to express her feelings. I would love to hear any thoughts on that.
Back to what kids are ready for. When your daughter brought that up and you simply answered, and she's like, okay. For now, she probably is okay, because she's still young enough that it'll come out sideways somehow, because they're so emotional and their body is so attached to emotions. At that age, they're learning how to hide things, but they're not fully there yet. And so at age 3 or 4, they are still asking what they need to ask. And as long as you're providing a safe container, back to that safe container, they'll ask another question when they're ready. And as they get older, then you can bring it up. I like to have books that talk about different situations, and also bring in people in my life. And the people I work with, I say the same thing. It's bring in people that don't just have a 2-parent household.
Mm.
Make it normal by what tribe you're creating in your own life.
Mm.
And that really does help. And there are so many single parent households now. Certainly there are still more two parent households, but there are a lot of single parents right now. And there's ways to bring them into your life.
It's interesting, especially where I live. I live in San Francisco. I live in Bernal Heights, which may not mean anything to the two of you, but it's a progressive neighborhood. And anytime I tell people that Dylan is the only solo parent in terms of who I know in our neighborhood, and our preschool has a lot of families from our neighborhood, people are surprised. They just assume like, oh, this must be so vanilla, like everybody must have, two dads, two moms, and like solo parents and three parents and whatever. I mean, just you'd think, especially in San Francisco. But I remember it was one of the first days of her preschool, which she started in May. And I was having a conversation with one of the moms, and she asked like, oh, how's Dylan doing? And I said, she seems to be really taking to it. I think she was really ready for it. She loves all the activities that they're doing. And I was like, it's a lot of new people. And then she goes, well, yeah, I mean, it's not only 24 kids, it's 48 parents, like times two. And that's the community we're in. But to your point, Meg, maybe it's just, I need to do a little more work finding those other families that look a little bit more like us. In addition to, the families who are currently around her.
Yeah, absolutely. Expand our tribe a little bit.
Well, I was thinking, I think we also get to talk about the benefits. I was just recently working with some parents, and they're cisgender heterosexual, but their kid was just exposed to a family with two moms and hasn't stopped asking why she doesn't get two moms, why she has to have a dad. So just remembering that there's positives and negatives and benefits and detriments to all situations, and getting to normalize that as well.
What a twist.
But right. And another thing, I just like to talk as much as we can about difference, because I think when we talk about difference, we're really modeling non-judgment as well. And just acknowledging some people's hair is this color, some people eat this food, some people have this in their family, just normalizing all of it. Even though, you spoke about that typical 50s stereotype that we were given, certainly I was given as a kid, we get to really explode all of them for our kids now. We have a lot more power, I think, than we had many years ago. And I think our main role is really normalizing everything and giving kids the ability to feel comfortable with all situations. Also, if we think about it and we come up with challenges later, how cool would it be if we were raised to just say, oh, well, this isn't what I'm expecting. Let's turn here instead. And it's really modeling all of it. It's modeling acceptance and stability and your inner power to make decisions for yourself, regulation, probably a lot more things as well. But that's really how I like to negotiate or start up with those situations.
Yeah, I love that. Also, some of the books that we read, the titles of them are sort of like All Kinds of Families or whatever it is. They usually have like a single mom, solo parent, or however you want to interpret it. And when we get to that page, I'm like, hey, that's us. And I like high five her. So I've been sort of infusing like, this is something to celebrate. And I can also understand, I don't have a frame of reference of growing up without a parent or without a father. Like I don't. And I am so aware of all of the unconventional choices I made to bring her here. And I've really been sitting with that recently because I just feel like I made those choices. She didn't. Side note, I'm guessing most parents can relate to the feeling of wanting to protect your child from absolutely any harm, physical threats from the outside world, or emotional threats, where you just want your child to feel a sense of belonging and normalcy and not standing out for any reason other than a positive one. I attended an event the other night. It was hosted by the This Is Actually Happening podcast. They're doing a mini series on non-traditional families. Please check it out. And one of the speakers said something really beautiful. Essentially, he was saying that we're all seeking love, belonging, and family, whatever that looks like. I really stand behind that. I'm not sure why I thought that somehow 2 to 3 years into Dylan's life, I would be really crystal clear on how to approach the topic of our unique family in a way that was age appropriate for her. We have been reading books about unique families. Whenever she raises a question, I answer it. But I also recognize that as she gets older and as she develops, she is in environments where the world is reflecting back to her that she does not have what most of her friends and peers have, which is two parents. And a main reason why I created this podcast was to talk to other families and to learn how they're having conversations with their little ones. And as those little ones grow, how do you evolve those conversations? I think I'm just afraid, I always have been, of presenting this topic to Dylan and saying, yes, we have a unique family. Our family looks a little different from everyone else, and her not being happy about that. The idea of yearning, like Meg talks about, yearning for something we don't have. I don't have a frame of reference for not having two parents in my household. In fact, my two parents stayed together during a time when nobody's parents were staying together. And actually, mine wanted to stay together. So even more unique in its own way. But I feel this sense of mama bear come over me when we have her little friends. Even a year ago, when these kiddos were like 2.5 years old, they're already talking about, because their whole world are their parents and their grandparents and their immediate family and maybe extended family. That's their world. And so when their world looks different from others, of course there's going to be some questions. And I just felt this protective mama bear sense around, like, hey, we're still trying to have this conversation. It so perfectly captures that life doesn't wait for you to have this like perfect way of presenting this information and perfect way of evolving it for each developmental stage. And something I feared going into this experience of, hey, I made these unconventional choices, she didn't. And I have to understand that perhaps Dylan is going to have some difficulties, challenges with these unconventional choices that I made. But I would be lying if I said that I don't have some anxiety around this topic and wanting her to embrace what I'm telling her versus feeling othered or different in a way that doesn't feel good to her. Last night we went to dinner with a family who we did a nanny share with, and they've become friends of ours, and their little girl and Dylan are besties. There was a point in the dinner where the little girl was sitting in her mom's lap, but just decided, now I'm in the mood to sit in dad's lap. And so they just did that transfer. And I'm just watching that and thinking like, yeah, Dylan doesn't have that option unless we're out to dinner with like my parents or maybe friends. But in a scenario like that, it was just, to me, poignant, in terms of her seeing a difference of like, oh yeah, she can sit in mommy's lap or daddy's lap, and it's her decision which one she wants to be in. And I remember that in my own childhood, there are times where I want more mom time or more dad time, and I had those options. In a sense, I'm just having this like reckoning, which it's not something new. It's something that I've always thought about even before Dylan entered this world. It's like, we're trying something very different here. And it's my job to normalize it as much as possible, but also create a world for Dylan where she feels super loved and super supported, and expand our community to embrace her. And Meg's right. I need to create community for her where she sees different examples of families, not just all traditional cisgender, heteronormative mother, father, child, or children. I think it just comes back to wanting the best for your child. And my hope is that she does embrace our unconventional family. And I have to be okay with how things develop. I can hope for the best. I know I'll be doing my best to create that community for her. And in the meantime, I just need to continue to have these conversations with her and answer her questions as they come up. And back to the conversation. I it's not that I think, I know I'm putting a lot of pressure on myself to figure out the absolutely perfect way to explain to her, as she gets older and she has even more questions and she's observed even more families. And then this idea of difference, as you say, Leora, I really want her to embrace that. I don't want her to feel othered by it. I also know that the world isn't necessarily set up to embrace this idea. So I'm just, yeah, I know, Meg, earlier, you're like saying we just do our best. Nobody's going to get this right. Or, I think there's just, and I know it's not a one-time thing to talk about this with her. We're going to have several conversations over the years. She's going to have several feelings that she's going to express over the years. How do you recommend, like, just how often do we talk about this, because it's not something that comes up all the time, but like, should I be more intentional about talking about it more regularly? Because ultimately the whole reason I'm doing this podcast is an effort to normalize what may be perceived as different, and remove that sort of othering energy from our family, but there's only so much I can do, right? And she's going to go off into the world and she's going to see what she sees and experience what she experienced. And even as early as 2.5, she had her little friends asking, where's her daddy? So, I mean, it's always going to be a reflection back to what her experience is. And so, yeah, I'm any thoughts on that?
Everything is a lifelong journey. Every part of we can think we're healed with something and then it comes up, right, 2 or 5 years later. So it will evolve. And there's going to be times when someone is really comfortable with having a unique family. And there's going to be times when they're not. And so when we are balancing that act of listening with more than just our ears, listening with our 5 senses to our children, we'll know. And again, how they talk to their friends is key, not to sit outside the door and listen, but be open. As they're learning how to ask another question, then you get to answer it. Or have you thought about that? There is such a fine line between asking too much, and oftentimes we're asking too much because we're not comfortable with it. So we're projecting our feelings onto them. And when we get more comfortable with whatever the situation is, it's easier to guide them. And oftentimes, if we are busy or we don't feel like dealing with it, then we might do a shut out. So there's a difference between the balanced state of listening and being open and shutting out. So as your kids grow, and do you always have to bring that up? In my belief system, no. You just kind of gauge where they're at. If you're out and about and you notice them staring at a family that has a 5-person or 3-person family, and you just pay attention and notice, and that might be a good time to say, hey, what are you thinking? Because we want to listen with more than our ears. So that gives you an opportunity to notice, I saw a little drop in their mood right now. And then ask that question. Still bringing it up in the books that we're reading, and again, encouraging conversation by story. It will come and go. There'll be times in their life when it will be disappointing, and there'll be times in their life where they're so darn excited that they have their one parent's full attention, they don't have to share it. Because there's that too, right?
Yeah. They don't know that yet, though.
They don't know that yet, but they will. My daughter, who I have one daughter I have 5 children and one I adopted. And for a while, she really wanted me to have a husband because she didn't have a dad. And then she went through spurts where she'd say, you know what, I really don't want you to have a husband based on how connected we were. And did she want to share me or not?
She's like, I want you all to myself.
Yep. I like having you all to myself.
Yeah. The example that you just shared, Meg, around just noticing that your child is noticing another family. I've already had that experience with her, where she's just, I can see her staring or looking. I had a conversation earlier about yearning, and just me having to make my peace with the fact that there will probably be some yearning that Dylan has for having a father. She has an incredible father figure in my dad. He's 80, like he's a very spry 80-year-old, but I hope we have him for a very long time. I don't know what that looks like. And so I while I recognize that in some regard she's feeling father energy, like she doesn't have a father of her own in right now anyway. Can you both speak to that idea of yearning? Because I feel like that applies to everything that we're talking about, whether it's the non-traditional family, like what you just said, Leora, about like they have two moms, I want two moms. I think for several years into a person's life in childhood, they're looking at the world reflecting back to them what's considered normal, and they want nothing other than that, right? And so it makes sense that if their life isn't looking exactly like that picture being reflected to them, that there will be some yearning. And so I'm curious to hear you both speak to that point, and also any thoughts on how to address that with them, if there is anything to address.
Yearning is something, it's a beautiful word. And it is, as parents, we want to get comfortable with that word. Throughout our lives, we yearn for things, and then it goes away. And so go back to that question when Dylan said, what's our family? Maybe there was a little yearning there, but then it was fine. And so when we go through that yearning, we want something we don't have because we think the grass is greener. And my daughter, I'll speak to that. Now she's 17, but when she came in at age 5, she really yearned for a dad for a long time. And I could see the pain. And I addressed that by telling her the truth, because I always tell the truth. I totally understand why you have a yearning. And that yearning will come and go, and we can fill it with other things. Because when we get caught up in something that we don't have, it can really disable us. So, for instance, if someone does not have a dad and they want a dad, how else can they expand their heart center? Because the yearning comes from our heart. And how can we expand our heart center? No, can a child have an animal? Can they learn something of passion? Even young kids, we can support something they're passionate about, even if it's dolls for a while or trucks, or because it's always going to evolve. Understanding as a parent, are we yearning for that? So if we're yearning for that, they're reading us all the time. And as we get more comfortable with our situation, it helps them become more comfortable for the most part. But, they're outside of us. They're not completely in us. And especially after age 7, they separate more.
Wow. That's like 3.5 years away. It's a hard thing to accept. What about you, Leora? Thank you, Meg.
Gosh, I love this idea of yearning so much. And I think you're so right, Meg, that it really is something that parents have to get comfortable with. I can't help but, be in this position to sit and want to fast forward ahead and think, if we are able to teach our kids how to get comfortable with the fact that we are going to yearn for things, and the answer isn't always getting that thing, fulfilling that, it is actually sitting with it, moving through it, and understanding that things might be different in a future point. Not necessarily just that we're going to get it, but that we might be okay with it. What an amazing lesson to be able to impart on our kids. I think about how much that would have impacted me as a teenager, where I was yearning or thinking that something was wrong. But instead, if I'd just been able to have that understanding, my life might have looked quite different. And I think, there's a lot in there with the yearning. Again, what you said, Meg, about what we're presenting to our kids, just making sure as parents that we've done the work. And certainly my experience as a parent is that all the work that I'd done up until now was a lovely foundation, but I was totally wrong in thinking that I'd reached a point and I was there. Actually, all I'd done was build a foundation. And now, as my kids grow, I'm having to learn and relearn everything all over again multiple times. And so just remembering, right, as humans, we got to keep growing and evolving and doing the work, because these kids are little sponges and they can tell what's going on for us.
As a parent, I yearn for things, right? Like we all do. We all yearn for something that we don't have until we understand the concept of what yearning means. So it is an important thing to get familiar with that concept, because we can always have our cup full. We just want to allow ourselves to expand that experience. So when it was just Kaylee and I had another child at home when Kaylee was with me, it was an expansion. We still did trips. And back then, if I didn't have enough money to do a trip, I'd figure out how to take a trip somewhere where it was affordable. It was all about experience and learning and not cutting off. And I would make sure that I wasn't sad about the situation. I was growing my life, not pretending, but growing my life, doing things to bring in passion for me and showing her, we can have all these fun experiences and that can fill your cup. And each year, of course, as we get older and our kids get older, we still want to live that way. We still want to expand. So we don't have yearning, because yearning, if we leave it unkept, if we just let it become that big gaping hole, it can lead to some really rotten behaviors that hurt us. So we want to be careful to not ignore yearning, but grow with it.
Yeah.
And I know we've talked a lot about stories. And I think in my experience, I can say that the most impactful stories are stories about ourselves. So again, they don't have to be stories about our direct experiences that are the same as what the kids are describing, but sharing stories and finding a way, to explain a time in our lives where we were yearning, or a time in our lives where we thought we were missing out, and showing them how we dealt with it. And as a parent, my kids are fascinated by the stories that I tell, and that's really where I manage to get them to open up and ask more, because they're also asking about me. They love hearing that.
That makes so much sense. Yeah. And this is probably maybe a generation before us, but like when I'm thinking, I remember some stories that my parents would share with us, but I have a feeling that parents today are a little bit more transparent with their kids, showing warts and all, which I think is extremely helpful for children to understand, especially like, hey, not everything's going to be perfect. And we fall down and we get back up, and those types of things. That actually is a question I have, is around, I know modeling plays a big role. And as you both have mentioned, and it's so true, they absorb so much. There have been several times when maybe I'm just extra exhausted, and I'll see Dylan, who I totally think is an old soul. I don't think she's a baby. My dad and I joke about this all the time. Like, she's just playing around, like she's actually an adult. But but like just watching her watch me, like she's observing, kind of like, okay, she's low energy, and will even say like, I love you, mommy, kind of almost like I take that in a particular way where she's like concerned something's going on with me, and it's like, nope, just exhausted over here, and I love you too, honey. But like, sometimes I wonder if it's like her way of giving me like a little vote of confidence, like everything's going to be okay. Or sometimes I wonder, like, is she freaking out? I don't know. But I have a feeling that, this is a universal thing. This is not just children of unique families, where the world is, the world is what it is, right? It's, there are going to be lots of challenges regardless of what your family looks like, regardless of the environment you grew up in. And, Meg, you and I were discussing this before, but, you can have the 1950s era traditional structure, and that's not necessarily perfect, and I know that very well. There's lots of families that experience a lot of trauma and dysfunction, even if from the outside things look pretty great. What are the strategies that parents can use to help their children build resilience? And whether that's, just resilience in general to what life presents, maybe it's societal biases. I know that the fact that Dylan was being asked at, just after 2 years old where her dad is, I mean, she's just going to be reminded a lot throughout life. And maybe there's stereotypes attached to that. I don't know, but I know resilience is key to navigating all of this. And I'm curious from your work, what you would recommend parents do to help build that.
It's always easier to build a strength like resilience when we're not in the middle of a crisis. So taking those small opportunities and being present. We can't be present all the time, but when we're with them, when we find those moments to be present and allowing them to speak and have that room for error, that helps them build resilience. That helps them not go down the path of being a perfectionist, because there's a lot of people that struggle with being a perfectionist, and that really runs rampant in our society a lot. And so it's easy to build off of that. Kids, my belief is that kids often duplicate their parents. One parent or the other is going to be more similar. And so if we work on our resiliency, it's easier to become more resilient. If we're watching our child who is really struggling and we haven't, it hits all of our old wounding. So pay attention as a parent how you're affected. I was speaking with a girlfriend of mine several weeks ago, and her high school student was losing friends. That was her issue in high school. So it was really driving that knife into her heart. And she was vicariously living all the pain and not recognizing it. So we want to go back. We can tell ourselves a lot of stories. If we go back to reality and get out of our illusions of the storytelling, get present, use the 5 senses. So as we teach our kids to get out of the stories and into the present moment, that helps them too. So using our body is so important. And by that, I mean helping a child develop skills that are not just mind-oriented, but body-oriented, both, because that strengthens more than just the mind. Otherwise, we can get too caught up in our mind. Resiliency comes from, in my belief system, learning how to be okay with failure, of course, learning how to be okay with mistakes. And as parents, we get to model that. When we make a mistake, is it devastation or are we okay? I've worked on this a lot in my own life, and my daughter and I were traveling somewhere, my 17-year-old, and we were running late, and we were at the airport, and the flights, there was 5 things that were going wrong. And she looked at me and she said, "Mom, take a breath. It's going to be okay."
Wow.
That's how I talk to her. So isn't that they get it?
Yeah.
That they have to see us model it most of the time. But what a beautiful opportunity for her to feel like the stronger one.
And for you to see your modeling in action.
Absolutely.
I think resilience, first of all, is wildly important. It's something that I talk to folks about in my work all the time. And resilience comes from one perspective, having a really strong sense of yourself, who you are and what you can do. And just like the senses, being able to come back to you, knowing who you are in this moment, is what helps us feel strong and secure. So in terms of talking with kids, they get resilience by having the answers to the questions and being validated that their feelings are valid. Their feelings are important. And you can feel something or think something, and it's not the truth. It's how you're feeling in that moment. We are not our emotions. We are not our beliefs. We don't have to attach so closely to them. We can have a thought or have a fear, for example, and then still be able to come back from that and know that that's okay. That fear is telling us something but it's not necessarily telling us that we have to be afraid.
One practice I've really appreciated is watching your emotions. Like you're having this emotion or you're having this feeling, but that's not you. It's just like observing them. This happened to me this morning. I was really surprised at how much self-doubt showed up in that moment, but I'm also happy that there was a detachment from it, that it wasn't like I'm believing everything that I'm doubting. It was just this like, whew, oh my goodness, like kind of giving myself a hug, like, whoa, that was a tough one. Like we had to like really dodge that one. There's just, I think there's what you said, Leora, earlier. It's just like before having children, you thought that you had done all this work, but really what it was you were forming a foundation, which is a huge thing. That's more than a lot of people have. But I had a similar realization where I was like, oh my goodness, I thought I had done all the work. Like I did all the work, and then in comes this child and so many things. I'm just like, wow, I didn't even get started. It's a tough mirror to face for sure. And I love everything that both of you are saying about resilience and like sense of self and, getting in your body. I know, Meg, that's something that you have to remind me regularly. And what's so ironic is the rest of the world thinks this happened twice in the last week, that somebody was like, wow, you're so calm. And I laughed and I was like, I don't know what you're saying. Like the last thing I am right now is calm, but it's interesting. It's just like, it's that practice of like just trying to ground, which I have to remind myself regularly. It's not something that comes naturally to me. I thought it did years ago. Life's different now. So, yeah. Side note. So, how many people can relate to how I was feeling very confident that I had done so much work on myself, and then all it took was having a baby to have that completely dismantled? And it doesn't have to just be having a child. It could be entering a relationship, or there's just a new situation in your life that you're trying to navigate. And you're like, hold up, I had this whole toolbox and somehow I cannot jimmy it open. That's how it felt. It's depending on where you are in life, there's so many things that can kind of throw you off kilter. And even if you have a super solid toolbox, and by that I mean just practices and techniques and modalities, anything that has allowed you to heal from anything that was maybe traumatic or triggering in childhood, and you're choosing not to bring it any further into your adulthood. I remember having a conversation with my acupuncturist who said, if you want to put all of the work you've done on yourself to the test, enter a new relationship. That can be a romantic relationship or having a child. Oh my goodness. Especially, I think we've all heard the expressions where somebody's like, oh my God, I sound exactly like my mom. And there's usually a note of concern around that. Becoming a mom has made me incredibly empathetic, not only to my own parents, but to all parents. It's well documented that it's a lot of work. It is. It also really tests you emotionally. I love the expression that I was a much better parent before I had kids. That is one of the wisest things I've ever heard. I wish I could remember where I heard that from. It's so true. You can have all kinds of ideas of what kind of parent you're going to be. And then you get into it and you're like, wow, I'm exhausted. There's lots of reasons why a parent is exhausted. There's a lot of mental load, whoever is what's considered the default parent. In my case, I'm all the parents, where you're constantly thinking like 50 paces ahead because you have to be prepared for lots of different situations that you didn't used to have to think about. And I know for me, I just want to show up as my most patient, my most empathetic self every day. We're human. We're human. It's a lot of work, and it's a lot of work on top of a full day, which is whether you are getting paid to work outside of the home or you're working all day inside of the home with your children. You're exhausted. And so those lovely techniques that you spent quite a bit of time and probably quite a bit of money on to learn to keep yourself really balanced they may not be readily available for you when you are super exhausted. And I know we're all doing our best. I know for me, it's really important for Dylan not to see me angry or frustrated. So I'll be as calm as possible when I'm interacting with her. And then I'll be like, oh, I'm just going to use the bathroom. And then I'm like, ugh. And I appreciate all the folks who've told me that it's actually not that productive to hide that. It's important for children to see that our parents have emotions too, and they can be exhausted and they can be frustrated. So I'm getting better about that, about letting her see my process of frustration, and usually deep breaths are part of it. And I know that modeling is a really helpful way to transfer techniques to self-regulate, not just parents. We're all just learning every single day how to navigate life, do our best, try to remain regulated. Kudos to everyone. I'm patting everybody on the back. And back to the conversation.
I was just going to add something about resilience, if that's okay, because I mentioned that I do so much of it in my work. And one way I think of resilience is with a visualization that I'll share in a moment. But I think resilience comes in handy for me. Instead of thinking it's me against the world, I think of resilience as me against my resilience. Me understanding where my resilience is at. So, we've spoken about this here in that there's, so much work in your awareness of who you are and where you are. And you said, Nicole, you had this experience this morning. I also had an experience this morning where I was just noticing I was having some really big feelings. And for me to then take a moment and be able to realize, well, you're pretty sleep deprived and you haven't had breakfast, and there's a chance you're a bit overzealous with the coffee this morning. That's what's going on. And then I had this opportunity to just take a beat and understand all these things were going on. And yet, again, coming back to who I am, being able to rectify, by like having some breakfast, drinking a whole bunch more water, giving myself some forgiveness for the fact that I'm tired. And then understanding, who I am and amongst all of this. And again, I work with clients a lot about actually checking in about where is your resilience at today? And what does that mean? Does that mean you need to rectify some situations? Does that maybe mean this is not the day for those big conversations or those hard topics? Does it mean actually that you need to start changing how you're approaching things because you've been telling me every single day your resilience is not good. It's not at the place that it needs to be. And I, mentioned that visualization, and one that I use a lot is imagining there is a bubble around us, and that is our resilience.
Oh, nice.
And ideally, the bubble is arm's length away, so that anything the world throws at us, there's tons of space for reverb, and it's not actually hitting us. It's just, getting closer with the bubble. But also sometimes we wake up and that bubble is a second skin. And again, instead of feeling like it's us against the world, it's us against how can I just push that bubble slightly further away from me so that there's a bit more space for the reverb and not every single thing feels like it's piercing or hitting me.
I don't know if either of you have read Don Miguel Ruiz's The Mastery of Love. In The Mastery of Love, it's a great book. So is The Four Agreements. But in The Mastery of Love, there is one chapter that talks about the poison arrows. So I've talked to people that I work with and my kids, of course, on, I love the cloak idea. I bring up Harry Potter and his cloak, the invisibility cloak. And also that people around everywhere sometimes are hurting. And they might shoot their poison arrow at us because they're hurting. And in that moment, they just want someone else to hurt. And we can take it personally, or we can let the arrow fall to the ground and not penetrate us. And to help them visualize that we get to decide what arrows we're going to let into our private bubble, like you so lovely put, Leora. And explain to them that we don't have to take it personally. And that's not something you'd say to a 3-year-old, but you could sure say that to a 5 or 6 or 7-year-old.
That question, where's your resilience today? What a great question, because it's going to fluctuate. There's no day that you're just going to have, there's no week that every single day is going to feel the same. And I think that's a great check-in question, because it also helps color or provide some context to however you're feeling, right? I know with women, especially, like if their period's coming and they're wondering why they're so emotional, and then they're like, but sometimes like it's just life's a little intense today, and that's why I'm not. And to your point, Leora, or like maybe I haven't had breakfast, or I'm not nourished on some level that needs to be nourished. All of those things. These are wise questions to ask ourselves to help build that resilience, for sure.
And it's a practice, right? It's not something that we just start doing immediately. We've got to learn how to do that. And again, give ourselves the forgiveness that we're not going to be perfect at it immediately.
I think many parents at times, depending on what the situation is, going back to what we were talking about earlier, like it could be death, illness, these things come on very quickly. Parents may not be prepared. I'm curious if you have any strategies, like what would be one strategy for parents to use if they don't have immediate answers to questions, or how to describe something to a child, whether they're asking a challenging question or there's just a challenging situation in front of you and they may not have the capacity to understand what's going on. If a parent is feeling a little flat-footed, what would you recommend they do in that situation?
So I think I want to start here by just reminding everybody, like this happens all the time, in big and small situations. And again, I know we've mentioned this so many times, but modeling, I think it's really okay to say, what a great question. I don't have the answer right now, but let me circle back to you, or and I think whenever possible, it's a great idea to give a timeline. So we're not just leaving things open and, floating around. So being able to say, what a great question. I need to think about that a little bit. How about I come back to you this afternoon or tomorrow, or whatever your timeline might look like. But really prepping them and actually following through, coming back with it is so important.
Of course. But I think the timeline is what sets them at ease, I would imagine. It's like, I don't have the answer now, but I will come back to you with something. It's like even hearing that as an adult, I'm like, oh, okay.
I'm a believer in the concept of love languages. And so even when we don't have an answer, some kids just need a hug, or need to have you touch their arm, or just sit on the couch and say, I'm not sure right now, as Leora said. It's that some kids are not touchers, so that wouldn't work. But sometimes just touching their arm or holding their hand or giving them a hug is enough reassurance in the moment when you don't have an answer.
That's great. Yeah, I love that. Well, Meg, Leora, thank you so much. Thank you for just all the wisdom, all the strategies, the great ideas, the emotional intelligence that you shared just here. And I know that anyone listening who has faced any of these experiences, whether it's just a tough conversation in general with their child, or specifically in the context of unique families, I know they benefited greatly from everything you both had to say. So thank you very much.
Thank you for having us on.
Also, if you're part of a unique family and you want to have a conversation with me, please reach out. Doingthisdifferently.com. Happy to chat with you. I think it's really important, as I've had these conversations with all these different families, normalizing that what makes your family unique is really helpful. It also helps children learn about inclusion and opens their minds as well as their parents, and gives everybody a shared language and understanding of what it means to be a unique family. Thank you again for joining us, and we'll see you next time.